Hello and welcome. My name is Brian Kaplan, editor of The Banker. I'm here today with Pierre Mustier, who's a former head of investment banking at both Société Générale and Unicredit. This year he became a partner in the private debt specialist Tikehau Capital. So Jean-Pierre, welcome. And obviously you've got great experience in the markets. In this new role, I think you're dealing with SMEs, small and medium-sized enterprises, especially in the UK, Germany and France. And we often hear a lot about how these are the backbone of the economy and drive growth forward. Is it possible to give us a sort of perspective on how they differ in character between those big three economies?
Well, Brian, they don't actually differ too much. They all bring quite a lot of new jobs to these economies and are really the core of the economic recovery we can see in each of the countries. They have many things in common. First of all, they depend a lot on their banks in terms of funding and financing. And that's true in every country, maybe slightly less in the UK, which is more disintermediated than continental Europe. But that's an issue for them when the economic crisis strikes and when banks lend less, because they are too dependent on their banks. Right. And we need to find ways for them to be accessing the capital markets to a certain extent. Okay. And they have as well something in common, which is that usually they are slightly short of capital. They can borrow from banks, but it's more difficult for them to raise capital, equity in the market. So usually when you're a banker, you're happy to lend to an SME company, but from time to time you're a little bit less easy because you feel their capital structure is not right.
Okay, so it's interesting you say that they're not that much different, because in the UK we're always hearing about, how good the Mittelstand are in Germany and how they're kind of financed and organized in a different way. But you seem to be saying, well, maybe that's been a bit overplayed.
I think one of the characteristics in Germany that the Mittelstand companies have usually a lot of liquidity because they are quite conservative in the way they manage their finance. But by and large, you don't have much difference between British, German and French SMEs. You have more difference with Italian ones, which structurally had less liquidity and much less equity for historical reasons, because the owners were taking out most of the cash and the equity from the companies. But in Northern Europe, it is very, very similar. And what is interesting is that in each of the countries, these companies actually are growing quite a lot and are finding ways to go around the banks in order to finance their development.
Okay, so that brings in Tikehau. So what is it that you're offering them that the banks can't offer them or won't offer them?
I think, as I mentioned, that these companies don't always have the right capital structure. So the banks might not be able to provide them with financing when they need it. And we at Tikehau, like some other funds, can provide financing which have a slightly subordinated feature, which allows us to extend the financing and the quasi-equity to these companies so that they can borrow and finance some of their development. So it's in the form of more quasi-capital, pref share equities, or in terms of what we call unitranche, which is a mixture of senior debt and subordinated debt.
Okay, but you must be very focused on the companies that you think are suitable for that kind of financing, in terms of analysing them deeply and sort of understanding their business model and being comfortable with them. Is that right?
Of course, of course. In fact, for each of the companies, whether they are very large companies or smaller ones, you need to have an in-depth credit review and analysis of the cash flows and the prospective revenues. But we do that as we will do with any other company. And when we feel comfortable, we are very happy to extend this quasi-equity and subordinated financing.
Okay, and of those three economies, I mean, the business people that you talk to in the SMEs, I mean, which set are the most optimistic about the future?
I think today when you speak to German SMEs, they have been quite optimistic in the past and keep being quite optimistic for the future. Germany has been very protected from the crisis, and German SMEs were big exporters, so they went through the crisis by developing their top line and seeing quite good business. The current environment from time to time shows a bit more difficulties. They were quite exposed for Eastern Europe, for instance, and clearly the crisis there has slowed down slightly their export potential. But I think the Germans are clearly the most optimistic of the lot. Okay,
now we're coming up to an election in the UK, and if the Conservative Party win, they're promising a referendum on the UK leaving the European Union. What sort of impact do you think it would have for UK business and the economy if the UK left the European Union?
Well, this election is mostly about sovereignty and the EU, when in fact it's about economics. 50% of export of Great Britain goes to the EU. So clearly, if we have the UK leaving the EU, it will have some kind of impact. One could say that there will be some trade agreement to be put in place, but the trade agreement will have a price, which is that the UK will have to follow a certain number of constraints coming from the EU, and it's going back to the sovereignty issue. So one can say that to a certain extent there will be an impact. Some commentators are saying that maybe up to 0.5% of GDP might be impacted by a Brexit, which is a massive amount. When you look at maybe the financial market, which is a large part of the British economy, it is maybe a milder impact that one could think about, because London as a financial center cannot be replaced by any other center in continental Europe, should it be Frankfurt, Paris, Milan or others. So I do feel that one has to look at more the industrial impact and how the British companies will manage to keep their export towards the EU. There will be some trade deals, but they might be at the expense of what the politician wants to achieve in terms of sovereignty.
Okay. Jean-Pierre, thank you very much for your thoughts.
Thank you.